Hey everybody, welcome back to the Sazabi Ver.Logic build. This is part 4. Here's what we have so far. On first glance, I think the first thing you'll notice is that there is a lot more detail than there used to be. I also just wanted to mention that one of the design philosophies I've had during this build is that if there is any design or element that I wasn't quite happy with, that I should strive to kind of improve the overall shape and silhouette, keep working on it a little bit more until I am a lot happier with it. Alright, next up, we're going to break down a few of these parts. I've tried to focus on adding panel scribing and scratch building and kit bashing detail on this. Most of the panel lines were scribed with BMC chisels, as well as the various notches taken out. So you can see here, there's a lot of additional panel lines scribed in to kind of segment off different portions here, and those will get slightly different paint treatments and just kind of emphasize some of the natural shapes provided by the original version here. And I also cut out some notches and added some protruded detail there. And I also wanted to use the new tools and carve a flat bottom on these circular details here, so I could add the photo etch metallic detail later on to these circular areas. Those will be super glued on after the paint. So you'll notice on the front fuselage here, I added some detail at the top to give a little more contrast between the rounded surface and the mechanical detail leading up to the exposed engine block, as well as adding some plow plate strip. I just bent slightly and then cornered it off at the front. That way I had a nice transition point between the armor and the inner frame elements. And just very briefly, I added these vent details, again from Kotobukiya. Pretty simple here. There's two parts. There's the outer part and the inner part. I drilled a tiny hole here so I can use a pin and pop that piece out. I drilled a little bit larger hole and inserted a plastic rod into it so it has a little bit more rigidity and bite to the part. And that just sits in this cavity here, and eventually will be super glued in place at the end of the build. I added a few more pieces of detail, some scratch built, some kit bashed, just to kind of break up the flat surface on the bottom here, give it a little bit more visual interest, as well as the arm connections here. There's a little bit more plow plate attached there and some notches and panels scribed in. If we take the propellant tanks off, you can show off the detail underneath the main element here. And so I just had started with the outline around the perimeter of the bottom to delineate the inner frame area and the outer shell area for painting purposes, as well as added this mechanical detail and kind of branched out from there. I had originally scribed this detail so it kind of wraps around the top here and kind of keeps these vents as a kind of a core unit. Added some plow plate strips here and there. And then I wanted to add in these scribed lines that get angled at the end and add some chiseled detail there. The first thing that was worked on since the last episode was the side boosters here. First element I worked on last time was the heat sinks here. And I used spread clips as the original template of these and filed down a few of the angles and flipped them back and forth, and that's what's given us our detail here. These ended up being glued straight onto the inner frame of the wing here to fit this notch here, and that fits pretty snugly on the sides here. I wasn't quite sure what to do with the other details here. I had scribed a couple panels, but I wasn't quite happy with them, so I filled those back in. These ones remain, and I added these raised details here, made from plow plate. But the next part was to add some detail here. So I ended up finding this piece from the legs or the thrusters of the GP02 Master Grade, and they had these interesting vent details. And I thought, well, if we have some heat sinks here, and the beam weapon at the front here, that logically this little engine part would be connecting the weapon to the heat sinks, so when firing the weapon, the heat would be dissipated through the heat sinks, so you could use the weapon for longer. And I also wanted the hoses to turn and wrap around into the heat sinks. So to do that, I found some runners that had some right angles and cut those out and glued them to this piece here. So these hoses here have some small detail there. I also carved a few notches into some of these faces here, added a little bit of detail with the claw plate there, and filled in the gaps here. For now, these are pretty much finished. They just have to be cleaned up, and that kind of moves us to the next part I wanted to talk about, and that is the extension on the thrusters here. So one of the parts I wasn't quite happy with was the silhouette of these thrusters. Originally, sitting down here, I was not able to see the tops of the thrusters here. Adding a few claw plate tubes glued onto the inner frame part here, which is detachable, as well as some smaller rods inserted into the thrusters, so I can take these apart and paint them separately. But they give me a nice silhouette along the edge here, kind of break up the surface, and then you get the rounded elements of the thrusters catching the light on the side. And related to that, I did the same with the engine here. So this has an inner frame part attached to the thrusters. So once the engines are attached, you'll be able to see them poking through the edge here. Because these are so small, I didn't have a tube small enough, so these are just a piece of square claw plate strip. But it's big enough that once inserted, there's enough rigidity that it'll keep it tight. Alright, so one of the other parts that I touched on a little bit more recently, working on the top cannon here, I ended up adding a bit more detail to it, adding some plastic tubes and inserting them into the existing rifle. And so it's got two pieces here, so I wanted to add a larger barrel on top as well as an element underneath. So this was just some plastic tubes from Wave with some plastic strips glued to the side and a strip here glued to the bottom and the top, and a little bit of scribing around the end of the barrel. Chamfered the insides using this tool here and just bored out the center, create a little bit more natural rounded edge. Add a couple strips of plastic into there, just kind of break up these shapes. In addition to that, I modified the fin a little bit, straightened that out on the top, and added a few notches there to kind of break up the silhouette. I also flattened this plane here a bit, making this a little bit more sharp. So another part I was prepping is I had cut out some parts for the turbines, and unfortunately the first attempt at gluing the parts for the turbine detail didn't quite work until I figured out how to rest the detail and overlap them. There's a long piece and a short piece. The short piece just adds a part for the longer piece to rest on, and so the short piece rests underneath the long piece at an angle, and then I just alternate between the short piece and the long piece until it wraps all the way around. And I left a bit of a gap between the propellant tank and the turbine blades, so I had room to add a mask so I could paint the turbine blades separately. The fin funnels are still going to be attached to the side here on these Kotobukiya molds there. On the interior side, there's going to be a magnet either on the inside wall or slightly drilled into the plastic, and then one glued in on one of the fins, just like we showed last time, and that'll snap in and rest on the outside just like that. Now, I believed in one of the previous episodes, I did mention that I may add an energy cable. I think that is one of the last detail components I decided to add, and I like the way it kind of breaks up the surface here. Gives it a bit more of an organic look in contrast with everything else. This is just using some wire left over from a broken set of iPhone earbuds, and I just trimmed that to length. I also wasn't quite happy with the detail on the front face of the fuselage up here. They gave me a great point where I can run the energy cable through. So it looks like it's coming from the engine and wrap around to the thruster housing at the top here, as well as the main weapon. And so I ended up using some energy cable parts from I think the Goof. This is one using a slightly angled angled one so that the cable would come out at a little bit more natural angle and wrap around to the front here. I also wanted to keep it tied down a little bit more neat, so I sliced one of those in half and glued that to this top surface here, and luckily it lined up with some of the notches I had previously scribed, so that was fortuitous. And this wraps around into the front dome here, and as you can see, you can zoom in the center there, I added some claw plate tubes for the wire to rest inside, and then here there's a hole drilled in here. Those poke out the back here, but those will remain primarily hidden. You can't really see them. I also wanted to make sure that I could display this properly. So I've got a base here from a spaceship statue, and it's like the perfect size for this project. I finally found an area that I can use to prop this up, and there is a small notch here next to this either beam weapon or vent detail there. I filled in some of that notch that I just carved back in because there's an open cavity there. But beneath that, there's a hole drilled out for this. So we'll just pop that off. We're gonna replace it later, but so this just goes in right there and slides in with friction like that. Alright, so there it is. I think it's just about the right size. And I'll probably putting it that way so that the silhouette kind of matches the shape a bit better. And it's just about perfect size for this. There we go, so hopefully we can take some cool photos of it. Alright, so I think that kind of wraps almost everything up. I just wanted to say that I'm pretty happy with the way everything's turned out so far. I spent quite a bit of time working on this, so it's going to be nice to move on to some of the later stages of this project. In the next coming episodes, we're going to be priming this up and getting it ready for paint, decals, and all that good stuff. So check back later for the next videos, and I'll see you next time. Later!